The idea that fraud is a victimless crime, that is completely wrong. Actually, fraud does have victims, and those victims do suffer very deeply. I'm Iona Bain. I'm a financial writer, speaker, broadcaster, and author. I've had a long-standing interest in the subject of fraud because as a financial journalist, I have come across fraud as a perennial problem in personal finance. And it's a problem that hasn't got any better in the 12 years that I've been writing about this. In fact, it seems to have got worse in many ways. And when it comes to fraud, it is so fundamental to understand how it works and how you can be vulnerable to it. Because if you don't, then all your hard work in managing your money could be for nothing. You could lose your hard-earned cash in a matter of minutes. Broadly speaking, there are two different types of fraud. The first is identity fraud. And this is when fraudsters will try to obtain your financial details and use that basically to steal your money. They may do that very simply by stealing your credit or debit card and then spending the money in your accounts. Or they might hack into a company's database that holds your personal information, and then either they get enough information through doing that to raid your account, or they might have enough information to contact your bank and then try and trick their security systems into giving over your financial details. But identity fraud is a hard fraud to pull off. Often fraudsters might not have the savviness to be able to hack into companies, and they might not have the opportunity to steal your data. And I think banks have done a fairly good job of figuring out when someone is calling them and they are not who they say they are. So there is a second type of fraud that has developed in response to those tighter security systems, and that is push payment fraud. And the whole purpose of push payment fraud is to convince you to hand over your money or to give fraudsters access to your financial details or your account. How does that happen? Well, it's because the fraudster is pretending to be somebody else. So the push payment fraud can take so many different forms. It could be in the form of a cold call from, say, someone pretending to be from your bank. They could be pretending to be working in the fraud department at your bank, and that there's been a fraud on your account and you're going to have to take the following steps in order to secure your account. But of course, that involves you basically giving your financial details to the fraudster. It could be a phishing scam, i.e. a text message or an email sent to you that's from a company that is purporting to be solving a problem on your behalf, or might be asking you to pay them a fee in order to sort something out. A good example of this is the recent delivery scams that have been doing the rounds. Lots of people now shopping online, waiting for packages at home. They might get a text message out of the blue saying, "We have your package, but you need to pay us X amount in order for us to re-deliver it." That's a scam. But then push payment fraud can also take the form of people promoting investment opportunities online that aren't what they seem. And these have massively proliferated thanks to social media and search engines. And basically, these are the types of scams where someone might be offering you a product or a service that turns out to be fake. And that is done with a view to getting you to hand money over. Whilst fraudsters will have an ideal victim, they will take anyone's money when push comes to shove. If they see an opportunity, they'll go for it. And they cast their net very wide. So in the case of cold calls and phishing texts and emails, those are indiscriminate. They're blanket and they're targeting a huge range of people. So that's why all of us have to be alive to that kind of fraud, because all of us can be targeted in that way. And also there is a psychological phenomenon that I came across a few years ago that I think has really helped me understand why people who are very smart can fall victim to fraud. And it's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is named after the experts that coined the term. It basically refers to this idea that we might believe ourselves to have more knowledge, more experience, and more savviness than is actually the case. We think we're cleverer than we are. And it's very human to overestimate our abilities, but it can lead us into some really catastrophic situations where we might misjudge the risks and overlook some really obvious red flags. And an example of that is when you think you are immune to fraud because, say, you're very tech savvy, you spend a lot of time on social media, and you think you're aware of all the scams that are doing the rounds. But actually, there's one that manages to penetrate through and make you think twice and make you think, actually, this looks like a great opportunity. Or perhaps you get a call from someone purporting to be from your bank, and you actually believe that that is that's the real deal. And I think those are definitely examples of why we need to be aware of that very human instinct to want to think that we're above fraud. We might read about these cases in the media and we might think that will never happen to us. But in my experience, fraud can and does happen to anybody, regardless of age, regardless of status. And fraudsters will target you if they're given the chance. And that's why you've got to be really vigilant. The question of whether someone will get their money back if they have been defrauded very much depends on the type of fraud they've experienced. So in the case of identity fraud, you will get your money back because the bank will take responsibility for that having happened. However, if you are the victim of push payment fraud, it's different. And very often you won't get your money back. Banks will often hold you responsible for having given the money over to fraudsters. And the banks will not necessarily take into account how sophisticated the fraud was. Now, not all banks will operate that same policy. We have seen some, like TSB, in recent times say they will refund victims of fraud, regardless of whether it's identity or push payment, and regardless of the circumstances. But not all banks operate that policy, and it is very much case by case. I think the reason why banks are reluctant to refund every victim of fraud is that fraud is happening on such a massive scale that were they to do that, it would really start to affect their financial viability. And also, we might find as bank customers that actually the banks would be forced to do things like make us pay for our bank accounts, which is not something that most of us do at the moment. Bank accounts, generally speaking, are free. But in a situation where banks would have financial difficulties, perhaps as a result of having to compensate victims of fraud more widely, then you could definitely envisage a situation where they would be starting to charge for services and products that were previously free. So that's why I think that we as bank customers might end up paying the bill for fraud. And that's why prevention is always best. It's best for the banks who don't have to compensate victims. It's obviously best for the victims who don't lose money. And ultimately, it also leaves the fraudsters without anything to show for their attempts. So I think that that's one reason why we've seen banks doing a lot more to educate and inform the public about frauds. They've been much more on the front foot. And they're also being a lot more proactive in stopping payments that they suspect are going to accounts operated by criminals. AI has had a huge impact on fraud already. And some of those effects are quite subtle, but nonetheless still quite, important. So for instance, in the past, one way to spot a fraudulent text or email that was phishing for your financial information was poor spelling and grammar, or language that just didn't sound like the organization that was contacting you. Now fraudsters can use the likes of ChatGPT to come up with messages that have got correct spelling and grammar, that are much more convincing, that mimic the language that would be used by that organization if it was trying to contact you for real. So that is one way in which fraud is being changed by AI. And also, of course, deep fakes are having a massive impact. So we're seeing lots of celebrities having their face and their voices cloned by fraudsters in order to promote investment opportunities. And that is happening on a huge scale on social media and through search engines. And unfortunately, so many of these deepfakes manage to convince the public that they are the real deal. And that's why we need a lot more education around how to spot a deepfake and why these types of investment opportunities are not what they seem. That is actually complicated further by the fact that some celebrities do back investment schemes that later turn out to be fraudulent. So we have seen a number of celebrities in recent years get embroiled in lawsuits around fake cryptocurrency schemes, for instance. And that unfortunately really muddies the waters because people will now see a celebrity endorsing a financial product, and they won't necessarily assume it's a scam because the celebrity might be doing that in a completely genuine, good faith way. They may not themselves know that what they're promoting is a scam. But unfortunately, that's why we need celebrities to be doing much more due diligence, why they need to be looking into these things a lot more before they put their name to it. But of course, the tech platforms as well could be doing a whole lot more to try and root out these deep fake investment scams from their platforms. And also, of course, you can use deep fake technology to pose as someone else when you're trying to get into somebody's bank account. Banks are becoming wise to that, but there is still a risk of it happening. My main concern when it comes to the next generation is that they are growing up as digital natives and using social media platforms every day, and that they may not be aware and informed about what a scam looks like. Well, I think that young people don't necessarily understand that when they are putting their pet's name on social media, or when they're sharing their address, or even just sharing their location, that they are, actually putting a lot of information out there that fraudsters could use to try to access their financial details and to therefore, successfully perpetrate identity fraud. I think the responsibility for teaching young people about fraud is shared by parents and families, schools, tech platforms, the financial sector, and the government, and all need to step up to the plate to teach young people what fraud looks like today, how it can take many different guises, what they can do to keep themselves safe, particularly online, and how they can spot a fraudulent scheme. Ultimately, though, I think the responsibility for preventing fraud lies with all of us. We all have to keep educating ourselves about fraud. And that's because fraud evolves and changes. Fraudsters will ditch certain tactics that they don't think are working for them anymore, and they'll figure out new ways to target us. So if the fraudsters are, in a sense, teaching themselves and learning and progressing, then we also have to teach ourselves and learn and progress in our understanding of how fraud works, so we can try to stay one step ahead of that. So I think a really helpful development in tackling fraud is the phone line that's been established by the banking industry that customers can use if they want to check whether somebody who's phoning them or texting or emailing them is actually from their bank. And I think that's going to be really helpful if it's rolled out by all the banks, and if all customers can access it for free. I think that could potentially be a game changer. It could give people a very quick and easy way to verify whether their communications with their bank are legitimate or not. I think that banks are becoming much more aware of the dangers of AI as well, and how AI could be used to manipulate their security systems. And that means that I think identity fraud is increasingly going to become a difficult kind of crime to pull off. I think the security checks that banks do these days are, for the most part, pretty robust in preventing somebody from posing as somebody else. And I think that the bank's education around fraud is getting better all the time as well, because, as I've said, prevention is the best approach. And if we can try to stop fraud happening in the first place, that is far better than trying to sort out its problems afterwards.